Okay, guys, welcome back. We're now going to get into the 1970s, or I should say late 60s, early 70s, and talking primarily of the Nixon administration, of course, a couple of years with Gerald Ford as well. And we're looking at the establishment of what's referred to as the New Left and the conservative attempts at fighting back. When we look at the 1960s, right, the United States was in turmoil. Not only protests against Vietnam War, but civil rights movement was also at its peak. At the same time, the counterculture on the left were growing in scope and visibility, and a lot of Americans, in the middle class Americans, I should say, were fed up with all of the turbulence. And so they bring in Richard Nixon to kind of fight back on all of these areas, right? So when we look at the roots of the rebellion, we want to first look, of course, at youth. Now, I think that it's very fair to state that the demographics play a very big role in the turbulence that is the mid to late 60s and early 70s. We've talked about the baby boomer generation before, and how they are the proverbial pig in the snake, right? That in every single period of their life, they were the majority demographic group. So in the 60s and early 70s, the largest single demographic group were college-aged people who were between the ages of approximately 16 to 25, but the numbers vary depending on how you slice it. But in any reality, this is the most rebellious age of a person's entire life. It is really rare for somebody to be openly hostile, embracing counterculture, and either vehemently or even violently resisting government when they're, say, my age in the 50s and what have you. And so the youth of the 1950s were not the young adults of the 60s, right? They had not experienced major depression or wars, anything that went on there. They fell into the sphere of civil rights movement, which led to them to apply the demands by African Americans to other groups, such as women, Native Americans, Hispanics, homosexuals, right? The new university-trained middle-class young adults found the escalating war in Vietnam of grave concern when, in 1966, the draft was modified to make them eligible. This would lead to the birth of the New Left and the anti-war movement, right? And so if you don't understand the demographics, you don't understand the movement. And it's primarily a youth revolt that latches on what was already proven to be a successful methodology, which of course was the passive resistance that was advocated by Martin Luther King Jr. And so because many of the professors on college campuses at the time were also anti-war, many of whom embraced Marxist ideologies or were just on the more liberal side of the spectrum, they found themselves in comfortable environments. And we notice from the last chapter, right, that this is around the time, right, 1965 is when the protest movement really started to get off the ground. And in 1966, it became even more violent. And it shouldn't be a surprise that 1966 was the year that college students became eligible for the draft. They could be excused from it, however, and this was a big deal, right? Before, they wouldn't be drafted. They were just exempted from the draft. Now, they had to go before a review board, a draft board, and argue for why they shouldn't be included in the draft. So, and lo and behold, the protests get more vehement, and we start with the draft dodgers burning their draft cards and all the other things that we now know from the narrative. So what we're looking at in this new left, however, is a new coalition of people on the left of the political spectrum, definitely more on the youth side, right? That was in the 60s and 70s, it's going to become, or I should say in the late 60s, early 70s, it's really focused primarily on the Vietnam War. It's interesting, for instance, to note that at the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was starting to advocate against the Vietnam War as well. there was very much of a countercultural aspect to this new left. And the idea of civil rights and the expansion of civil rights into various groups is also very important to kind of keep in mind. And then, of course, a new form of feminism that we saw tinges of it in the 1920s when women first got the right to vote, something called the Women's Party. And yet, right, we see it as a new manifestation here in this time period. So this new coalition of activists are going to form a new political wing that is going to fight to find its way in the two-party system. So for feminism, we see here in the photograph of Betty Friedan, and Betty Friedan is considered the founder of modern feminism, and she writes a book in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique, and what she wanted was to have women given more opportunities and access to more opportunities, because a woman should never feel that the cult of domesticity is, in fact, her only path, right? So she writes in one part of the book about how she's, a mother and a wife and running around and doing all this stuff to be successful in those things, and one day wakes up and goes, is this all there is? Is this what defines me? And it's a dilemma that a lot of people get into, but for women, it's a trap that's been placed on them for literally millennia. And so the feminine mystique kind of culminates in a movement that brought thousands of women together on August 26th, 1970, to march for gender equity and to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women suffrage. Now, the sexual revolution here really stems from the fact that women begin to understand that their sexual desires and appetites are as valid as the males, and that their desire to be fulfilled in that element is not wrong simply because they're female. And the so-called double standard, right? And on top of that, however, is the whole sexual revolution in terms of what does gender mean to power, to access to opportunities, and to the distribution of resources. And this becomes a very harsh, I should say, structure, right? This is really difficult conversations to have, and so women are going to really push to try to get these conversations happening, really things that are still controversial even today. So the pill that gets introduced at this time period is really considered by some historians to be the thing that's going to give women liberation, let's say, from the cult of domesticity and from traditional patriarchal structures in terms of what women are supposed to do with their bodies and what they have to protect themselves against, right? The fact that a woman could control her menstruation, control her childbearing years, is an incredibly liberating thing that many believe launches the sexual revolution. So the National Organization of Women, which Betty Friedan starts, is still considered the nation's leading feminist organization right now. And it's going to go about trying to getting an amendment to the Constitution called the Equal Rights Amendment. And essentially, it's much more complicated than what I think either side wants to say. But in a nutshell, Equal Rights Amendment was at its heart, it was an attempt to clarify that the 14th Amendment applies to gender as well as all the other things. So if you read the 14th Amendment in a strict sense, literally, it says that no citizen can be denied due process of law regardless of race, color, creed, or previous condition of servitude. It doesn't specifically say gender. And so the Equal Rights Amendment was primarily about this. It's going to be passed by the Congress twice and sent on its path of ratification. And the second time, it gets an extension from the Congress about how long it takes to get ratified. And in both instances, it fails to get ratification. Now, part of this is that the courts, the federal courts, clarify that because the 14th Amendment says all citizens, that women are, in fact, covered under the 14th Amendment. So it's I think conservatives like to point to the failure of the ERA to show that feminism, it really doesn't have the broad appeal that they think they have. But I think it's important to note that while the ERA was being debated, there was this element in the federal court system saying, no, you don't need an ERA. The 14th Amendment covers women. So that's still an issue of controversy, both with judicial historians and social reformers as well. Now, abortion rights are this is an issue that has very long legs in a sense. Multiple states already permitted abortions. The purpose and the rationale behind what was the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 was a conversation about whether a woman has the right to determine something for herself because it involves her body. And there was a previous Supreme Court case, Griswold v. Connecticut, wherein the Supreme Court said that a state could not interfere in the private sexual practices of a couple. In this particular case, the right to purchase birth control. The state of Connecticut had it very tightly controlled and would only permit persons who were married to purchase birth control. And so the court said, no, you can't do that. And they got there through the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment guarantees us a right against illegal searches and seizures. And the court decided that Fourth Amendment implied a right to privacy. Building off of that rationale, the court in the Roe v. Wade decision said that a woman's body is the most private thing that you could possibly imagine, and that a government doesn't have the right to go in and tell her what to do with her body. Now, there has been lots of controversy about this case. It is protested for almost every year, huge demonstrations every year on its anniversary, both for and against the ruling. And it has remained this way, in my opinion, because the court interjected in a way that's somewhat convoluted constitutionally. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her confirmation hearing, said that she would have argued it under the 14th Amendment and had a more direct constitutional path to it. Others have said that it should be argued under the 9th Amendment, which is unenumerated rights. Regardless, it remains a very controversial opinion. Now, the biggest controversy had to do with the idea of women as voters. And this is still something that's rather contentious. And that is the notion that women vote as a bloc. Starting with the Women's Party back in the 1920s, and then again with the National Organization of Women, there was this premise that somehow women would, in some ways, have a philosophical consensus about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a feminist, and how you then should vote on various issues. So, for instance, people thought that only some activists believed that only men would be protesting the Roe v. Wade decision, and yet, as you would can probably imagine, there's any number of women and girls who protest against the Roe v. Wade decision. And this creates this dilemma, right? Is there such a thing as a quote-unquote woman's vote? And so we see this, and it becomes an issue of politics because everybody likes to find what they refer to as the gender gap. And traditionally, the conservatives get fewer female votes than liberals. But it's still a rather contentious issue to talk about. In other areas of civil rights, we start with Cesar Chavez, who's there in the center of the photograph with Bobby Kennedy during a great boycott in 1968. Cesar Chavez ended a 3-week fast by taking communion and breaking bread with the senator during his campaign for president. Now, for the term Hispanic comes into vogue in the 1945 to describe Hispanic-speaking citizens of the United States. After World War II, Hispanic leaders worked along the same lines as African American civil rights leaders to secure the same rights for Hispanics as Anglo citizens of the United States. So because of the violent protests by whites against forced desegregation, school buses in South Boston, right, are escorted, as you can see here in this photograph. And we get this very interesting thing that, a lot of people who live in the North don't like to talk about, which is Northern racism. Northerners, particularly in urban areas, like to think of themselves as this very erudite and educated and progressive thinking people. But the fact of the matter is, as more and more African Americans and Hispanics migrated north to the factories and the cities, Northerners started to show their own particular biases. Now, in the late 1960s, American Indians adopted the sobriquet Native American instead of American Indian. And they began to work to retain their native identities within their ever-dwindling numbers. And a very strong sense of malaise within Indian cultures in the United States. So in 1973, a group of Sioux warriors at Wounded Knee protested the light sentences of a group of whites received after killing a Native American, and they took hostages. The standoff ended when the government agreed to readdress Indian treaty rights, but not before blood was shed. And the American Indian Movement, or AIM, is going to start to advocate for more rights for Native Americans. And I should argue, too, they're also arguing, to a very large extent, that courts needed to treat Indian redress of grievance with the same intensity and seriousness that they would for other people. And this is going to become something quite powerful recently. Starting in the 1970s, Indians are going to demand reparations for monies collected by the federal government for land that was allocated to Indians under the Dawes Act. That court case is still playing out today because the government just constantly finds excuses for not following through on the court orders to make good on these things. Now, when we get to the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, civil rights for African Americans start to go into what I would refer to as convergent issues. So I mentioned earlier that Martin Luther King Jr. started to protest against the Vietnam War, and he gets a lot of criticism from this, even from civil rights activists who felt that he was taking his eye off the prize. Right? He was focused on other things, and Martin Luther King tried to address this, and of course he is tragically assassinated before he could really articulate it. But it's this idea that the war and civil rights were convergent issues, and in particular here, because a vast majority of African American males were not in college, they were finding themselves disproportionately drafted into military service. And so the average recruit, or I should say the average draftee on the front lines in Vietnam was 19 years of age and either black or Hispanic. And there's no other way to look at this other than, racial indifference at best, or, just outward hostility at worst. And so there had to be some sort of a remedy. And the one of them is going to be to raise, or I should say, lower the voting age to 18. So this way, if I'm old enough to be drafted, I should be old enough to vote, right? And this creates a lot of other issues that we'll talk about. Now, this period of time is also going to see the beginning of the gay rights movement. And it's an event that's referred to as the Stonewall Riots. So now, what was going on? And this is something that, which is really wonderful for us as contemporary Americans. It's hard for young people to understand this, but when I was young, homosexuality in a lot of cities in America was considered a vice, meaning it was along the lines of prostitution and drugs consumption. It was considered a moral transgression that rose to the level of illegality. And so most gay and bisexual Americans lived, quote unquote, in the closet. Well, there were still, establishments that catered to gay clientele, and the Stonewall Inn in New York City was one of those. And what happened was the Vice Squad within the police department would raid these establishments periodically and simply arrest everyone, take them downtown, fingerprint them, right, all this other stuff. And in most instances, they were either not fully charged or they paid a fine and left. And that seems on the surface to be a very benign act. However, the police publish their arrest information in the newspapers. It was referred to as the police blotter. And newspapers would pick that up and print that in their papers. If you were a man, a gay man, arrested under those circumstances, your name now was going to appear as someone having been arrested at the Stonewall Inn. Well, everybody essentially knew what that meant. And so now it's basically the police outed you, and now your friends, your employer, your family all know. And this would lead to a lot of alienation, lost jobs. I mean, it's an incredibly traumatic event. When the Stonewall clients heard that there was another raid about to take place, a riot erupted. And the violence in which the police put it down elicited national attention. By the end of the 1970s, the majority of momentum in this movement was gone, but it's going to revive itself again. But in 1969, many people would say it was the beginning of the gay rights movement that we understand it today. So now, Nixon had won the presidency in 1968 by promising the South that he would slow federal demands for implementing civil rights. And this big issue here was going to be busing. He tried to prevent desegregation, but was overruled by Supreme Court, something called Swan versus Board of Education of Mecklenburg, Charlotte Mecklenburg. And 1969 or 70, if I get that right. Now, at the heart of this revival of conservatism is this idea of states' rights. Now, states' rights is an issue that automatically gets tied to the Civil War, Southern secession, and by logic, connection to slavery. So from the period of the Civil War until really the 1940s, it was almost taboo to talk about states' rights. The Dixiecrats, who break away from the Democratic Party in 1948, tried to reestablish this conversation. They are obviously humiliated in the elections. Nixon is going to reintroduce this within this context of law and order, that the states should, in a sense, have certain powers that they didn't have previously, right? And Nixon was going to secure legislation to allow $30 billion in federal revenues to be given to the states in the form of what are called block grants, to be able to use them in whatever way they saw fit. And so this became part of Nixon's Southern strategy. So for somebody who's not necessarily as read up on these things, these seem like rather benign issues, but this becomes what some historians refer to, or some civil rights activists will talk about, something, the term we use is a dog whistle. Most people don't hear it, but the dogs do, right? And in this case, these were the blue dogs, right? The Southern Democrats are going to hear these conversations from Nixon about law and order, about states' rights, about block grants and new federalism. And they're going to see that and hear that, and they're going to think to themselves of their own empowerment, which for them meant white superiority. And so, Nixon is going to use this to start drawing Southern Democrats out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party. And this is pretty much what's going to happen in the 1970s, is large numbers of white Southern Democrats are going to become, in a sense, Republicans. So Strom Thurmond, who was the Dixiecrat candidate in 1948 for president, is going to switch and become a Republican and get elected to the Senate. So now, what's somewhat interesting is Nixon's creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. In the late 1960s, Rachel Carson had published a book called The Silent Spring, which is about the use of pesticides, particularly DDT, and the fact that it created thin shells for eggs, for birds' eggs, and was leading, she believed, to a depopulation of birds. Her numbers turned out to not be exactly correct. However, it spurred the modern ecology movement and Earth Day and those sorts of things. And Nixon creates the Environmental Protection Agency to try to get a grip on what was happening to the nation's air and water quality and other forms of, I'm just going to call that ecological exploitation. Now, some historians have looked at this and they see it with a little bit more skeptical eye. I'm not exactly sure how to put it. It wouldn't surprise me given Nixon's personality. Nixon had a hostile Congress. He had a hostile press. And Nixon wanted to put forward his new federalism idea, which was devolving power back to states that the federal government had begun to assume starting in the 1930s. And some historians look at this and they think that Nixon was engaged in things like the Environmental Protection Agency as a way to try to buy goodwill from the Congress that they would then turn around and help him with his new federalism and his Vietnam policy. And of course, neither of that was going to happen. Now, what happens? The Nixon administration saw the beginning of a rise in inflation that would last to Reagan in the 1980s. So by 1970, inflation had reached 6%. Now, if you're not understanding what that would mean, today we have inflation below 2%. And even at that point, the Federal Reserve in the United States right now constantly monitors the inflation rate, because if it goes above 2, they want to change interest rates in order to keep that inflation rate under control. This is 4% above that. So the nation was experiencing a period of economic recession. At the same time, inflation ran rampant. Now, this became known as stagflation, and it's an amalgamation of two terms: stagnant economies, meaning no growth, and an inflationary economy, which means prices are rising. Now, here's the problem with it. As you've known in the previous segments that we've talked about, there was something referred to as the post-war consensus. And on domestic issues, Keynesianism was the agreed-upon formula for domestic policy. Well, there's a problem. Keynesianism does not account for a stagflation scenario. So, under very basic macroeconomic policy and Keynesianism, whenever inflation is high, unemployment is low. And then the reverse is true. When inflation goes really high, right? So if inflation goes really low, unemployment's usually rising. Here you had the inverse of that. It was not doing what it normally does. And the problem with that is, how do you formulate an economic policy to address both of those without causing problems in either one? And what we see in the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations are attempts by three presidents from two different parties trying to use Keynesian formulas to solve a problem that Keynesianism doesn't even really acknowledge. And this is a very big problem. Now, Nixon believed that the inflation was happening because of pressures put on the US dollar because of its usefulness for international trade. So in 1947, after World War II, there was something called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And in this, the United States and I want to say 47 other countries agreed on creating an international currency system. And essentially, the United States dollar, which was the strongest currency at the end of the war, would become what's referred to as an anchor currency. So the value of the dollar would be tied to gold. All the other currencies of the world then would trade and float vis-a-vis the dollar. Now, by the time Nixon comes to power in 1969, a lot of international transactions, definitely in oil transactions, right? OPEC, for instance. Almost all international exchanges were happening and being negotiated in dollars. And this created a huge problem for the United States. And there was, in fact, pressure put on the dollar for that reason. Nixon believed that that was the pressure creating inflation. So in 1971, Nixon took the United States unilaterally out of the Bretton Woods. In other words, he allowed the US dollar to float. The problem, of course, is floating the dollar makes it liable to inflationary trends. More susceptible to inflationary trends. And so when the United States supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War against Egypt and Syria, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, raised its prices 400% for those countries that supported Israel. And this had a devastating effect on the American economy. Gas lines, right? People were in their cars lined up for miles just to get gas. As you can see here, the sign, right? Sorry, out of gas, right? In some parts of the country, in New York, where I grew up, I remember they rationed gas. So there were no vanity plates then. So if your license plate ended in an odd number, you were allowed to go get gas on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You could fill your tank. If you were an even numbered license plate, you went on Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays. And then Sunday, the gas station was closed. I mean, imagine how this would have an adverse effect on the economy. More importantly, so much of the U.S. economy is dependent on oil and gas. Not so much now as it was then, but all your food, all your products were transported by train or truck, which both used diesel fuel. I mean, this was an enormous catastrophe to the United States, and so the energy crisis is going to create a problem for the United States and lead to something that economists or economic historians refer to as the economic malaise, and that's going to culminate in the years that Jimmy Carter was president of the United States. Now, with Vietnam, Nixon had promised peace with honor. Now, when he was inaugurated, the United States had over 530,000 soldiers in Vietnam, and he believed that victory was unattainable and planned to gradually withdraw American troops, as a sufficient number of South Vietnamese troops were trained to replace them. And so, in 1973, Nixon did away with the draft, and the Army became purely voluntary. So, this process that's referred to as Vietnamization, or the Nixon Doctrine, was the belief that Asian future had to be in the hands of Asian people. So the slow withdrawal of troops had a horrific effect on the military's morale. No one wanted to be the person to be the last one to leave or to possibly die in Vietnam. So the events of the Malay massacre further eroded American support of the war back home in the United States. So the divisions at home were coming about because, again, right, Nixon takes power in 1969, and in 1971, the war's still going. It just doesn't seem to end. And now, the government had initiated back in the Johnson years negotiations with the North, referred to as the Paris Peace Talks. Well, prior to 1972, those talks weren't getting anywhere. George Carlin, who was a famous stand-up comedian at the time, had this news program, and he, a sort of humorous, mocking news broadcast, and in it he talked about how good news from Southeast Asia, no one died in Vietnam today, but 3 people died of old age at the Paris Peace Talks. And it, just because there just nothing was happening, right? And so, the United States had over 150,000 soldiers still in the field. And it's not going to be until 1973 when the last combat troops left and 600 prisoners of war released. And within 2 years of American evacuation, South Vietnam is going to fall to Northern forces. So what happens in the United States, and as you can see here, the picture here is of the Kent State massacres, as they were referred to. This was a protest at a college campus in Ohio. 4 students were shot and killed by ROTC cadets. And in an amazingly bizarre way, the polls showed that the average voter felt like those kids should have been in school where they were supposed to be, which is, of course, just frightening to think of the callousness of that. But regardless, right, this is part of that, silent majority that Nixon talked about. And now what happens is in 1972, actually in October of 72, Henry Kissinger is going to announce that a peace settlement is at hand in Southeast Asia. Now, the problem with that is this was preceded by something referred to as the Christmas bombings, which happened in December of 1971. And this just angered Americans because these bombings were of Cambodia and Laos, which were technically neutral countries. Nixon decided that the United States had to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail and give the North Vietnamese the impression that the United States was prepared to escalate and to take, or I should say, inflict more harm and casualties on the North. It can be argued that the North did sort of, quote unquote, get the message, and their participation in the Paris peace talks did become more animated. But the Peace Treaty of Paris is signed in January of 1973, same day that Lyndon Johnson dies of a heart attack. I don't know if there's a connection, but it's somewhat a tragic day for a lot of people. And the United States is going to remove its last troops in 1973. Gerald Ford, who will become president in 1974, tries to maintain financial and military support for the South. The Democrats, who controlled the House and Senate of the Congress, are going to refuse to give that support. And in 1975, the South Vietnamese regime falls to the North. And in one of the more dramatic moments, the evacuation of American embassies and institutions in South Vietnam, all of Vietnam falls to communism. Now, one of Nixon's successes is going to be his Nixon doctrine and the idea of expansionism, of the idea of containing the Soviet Union. Now, Henry Kissinger, who initially was Nixon's national security advisor, is going to become Secretary of State. And he engages in something that's now commonplace, but he sort of starts this policy of what's referred to as shuttle diplomacy. And the idea that the Secretary of State would travel from spot to spot to engage in personal face-to-face negotiations. Prior to this, it was more common for negotiations to take place between ambassadors under the direction of their foreign ministers. Kissinger believed that in this bipolar reality, meaning Soviet-U.S. hegemony, that the United States and the Soviet Union had a vested interest in keeping all conflicts local, so they would not escalate into major international instances or brinksmanship that could result in unintended nuclear exchanges. And so Kissinger believed that by having the leader of the diplomatic community, in this case the Secretary of State, traveling directly to places and speaking face to face with individuals would convey to them the seriousness of the issue and help to accelerate the resolution of certain problems. And, Kissinger does this in the Yom Kippur War. He gets a Nobel Prize. He is going to use this in the conversations for the Paris peace talks. And he uses it in particular in what he called the China card. Now, in 1969, the Cold War had really sort of frozen shut. And the United States and the Soviet Union were, in a sense, in a stalemate. Khrushchev is replaced by Brezhnev. Brezhnev really wants to move the Soviet Union back into tighter control over its satellites, something that Khrushchev thought he could thaw. And the United States had been trying to negotiate under something called détente to get the Soviet Union to agree to limiting the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that were deployed around the globe. Now, the Russians were basically dragging their feet, and this was in part because the Soviet Union saw the United States bogged down in Southeast Asia, primarily in Vietnam, and essentially getting their butts kicked, and all of the money wasted, and all of the internal domestic disruption. And they basically didn't feel like it was in their best interest to help the Nixon administration, or any administration for that matter, recover any kind of lost ground. And so what happens is that in these shuttle diplomacies that Kissinger engaged in, he came into contact with individuals who were diplomatically associated with China. The United States had no diplomatic relations with Communist China. In fact, in the Security Council of the United Nations, China's seat was occupied by Taiwan, or the nationalist Chinese. And this was primarily because of the United States. And so in his diplomatic shuttling, Kissinger comes in contact with Chinese diplomats. And there was a not so well kept secret that China and the Soviet Union were in a great deal of combat, both ideologically and physically. In the 1960s, 50s, there's an actual border war between the Soviet Union and China over China's western boundaries. And then there was, in a sense, a philosophical argument happening between the two, between whose expression of communism was the most pure. Was it Maoist or was it Leninist? Was it, right, these sorts of things. Who had the best Marxist ideology is essentially the way you would look at it. And Kissinger decided that China could be that sort of like trump card, if you will. And so in February of 1972, the famous headline, "Nixon Goes to China." Here you see President Nixon toasting Chow and Lai. And these live pictures just get transmitted around the world. And Kissinger was right. Nixon returned from China and got an invitation to go to Russia. And so in May, Nixon travels to Moscow and signs what's referred to as the SALT I Agreement, Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. And this was the idea that you could, in a sense, freeze the deployment of additional weapons. This was something under what was referred to as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And this is the idea that you can manage crises because both superpowers have enough nuclear power to wipe out the planet. And therefore, it was a bipolar management system, that the Soviet Union and the United States was the only really important diplomatic relationship on the planet. And so long as the United States and the Soviet Union to engage in this sort of thing, that everything else would fall into place. So, now, this is in 1972. This is all in 72, which is an election year. Nixon is running against a very left-wing Democrat, George McGovern, and yet Nixon has convinced himself that the media and the sort of political wonks were all sort of out to get him. He had constructed what we call an enemies list, and we get into the saga of what's referred to as the Watergate scandal. Now, the foreign policy accomplishments of Nixon made him virtually unbeatable in 1972 election. The Democrats nominated McGovern, but he was crushed, receiving 17 electoral votes to Nixon's 520. I mean, it's a slaughter. The election was marred only by an odd break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, located in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. So the election of 1972, and this is the part where I'm never able to reconcile this. Why was Nixon so paranoid and obsessed with his election in 1972? This obsession allowed him to, in my opinion, surrender a lot of authority to a group of people in the committee to re-elect the president, referred to as the Dirty Tricks Club. This is what they called themselves. And this moronic frat boy type of world that they lived in very quickly trips into the illegal. Now, Nixon wanted to defeat the Democratic candidate. I don't remember anyone at any time claiming that Nixon was ever in jeopardy. Think about what's going on in 72. The rapprochement with China, the SALT agreement with Russia, removing troops from Vietnam, and then, of course, announcing in October of 72 that there was going to be a peace settlement in Vietnam. This is unbelievable stuff. And yet, Nixon is paranoid. And the Dirty Tricks Club decides, and this is H.R. Haldeman, this is Gordon Liddy, and Ehrlichman. These guys decided that it was important for them to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, again, located in the Watergate Hotel, which is why it's called the Watergate scandal. And what's odd about it is that they decided that they were going to dress up like plumbers, break in, and they really wanted to obtain, in my opinion, they were looking for two things. First, all campaigns keep a naughty file on their candidate. So these are all the dirty little secrets that the candidate would prefer the public not know, but that the campaign knows about because they want to be prepared just in case any of this should leak out and they have to have an answer prepared. And so the Republicans wanted that dirt. The other was to find out the spending strategy for the McGovern campaign. As you may or may not know, all presidential elections are state by state. There's no such thing as a national election, right? Every state gets electors, and every state determines whose electors go to the Electoral College. And so Understanding what your opponent is doing with their campaign funds is similar, in my opinion, to finding out what the other team's playbook is before you actually start to play the game. And if you know, for instance, that your opponent is going to be spending a lot more money in, say, Illinois because they think the race is really tight and they can win it, well, then you know that that's where you need to put their money. And so these are the things that they tried to get. And then they just stole some petty cash in order to make it look like it was, in fact, a break-in. And they get caught. Now, and really, when you think about why Nixon's administration is going to be brought down, it's not so much about the break-in as it is about uncovering the cover-up, right? Nixon is informed of the break-in. We don't have as solid evidence that he ordered the break-in. So that is still a matter of historical controversy, so far as I know. But what I do know is that Nixon was informed pretty quickly that, in fact, these guys were part of the committee to re-elect the president. Some of them were former FBI people. And so now, what happens, right, is that prosecutors started to uncover some inconsistencies. So if you think about it, if I have somebody who I arrest for breaking and entering, and it's a petty theft, and nobody's hurt, and it's a first-time offense, chances are the person could end up with just probation and a fine, or the person could end up for just a minor amount of prison time. So Nixon's committee to re-elect the president, or what the media called creep, paid what's called hush money to these burglars to just sort of shut up, take their punishment, and receive a nice little chunk of cash when they get out. Now, what happens, of course, is that prosecutors start to find out the backgrounds of these people. It's not typical for somebody to engage in breaking and entering and have an FBI clearance, for instance. These are things that were just inconsistent, and this got prosecutors to go after it. There were two reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, who were working for the Washington Post. They were able to keep the story going because they saw all of these patterns. More importantly, they had an informant inside the government. Now, today we know that individual was Mark Felt. He's an FBI agent who was leaking information to Woodward and Bernstein. At the time, he operated under the code name Deep Throat, which was a pornographic film that had come out, I believe, in 1971 or 72. And so between 1972 and 2007, the American people did not know who was this informant. And so Mark Felt came out publicly in 2007 because he was on the early stages of Alzheimer's, and he and his family wanted to clear the air. Woodward and Bernstein had pledged and promised to withhold that person's identity until either they revealed it or they died. And so probably one of the best kept political secrets in American history ended in 2007. But Woodward and Bernstein were able to use that information to keep pressure on the president. And so the plot begins to unravel, right? So Nixon refused to turn over documents requested by Congress, citing executive privilege. Now, when one informer revealed the presence of a taping system in the Oval Office, this started a year-long battle for the Nixon tapes. Eventually, Nixon had to turn them over, and they were found to have been tampered with. Now, he initially tried to do it through transcripts. He had secretaries type out these things with major pieces redacted. And he would claim that they were national security or profane language. This created a sort of like a humorous lexicon of American language. Whenever there was dirty words, the women would type in brackets expletive deleted. So it became kind of like this silly little joke to be like, oh, you know what, you're just another expletive deleted, kind of like making fun of the sort of prudishness of it all. But anyway, the fight over the tapes is going to lead to a Supreme Court case called the United States versus Nixon. And it was a decision on the court as to whether or not a president has executive privilege given a criminal investigation. And the court ruled that no, the president does not have executive privilege when it includes information that is evidence in a criminal investigation. That ruling came down in July of 1974. And what is an interesting sort of a fact, if you will, is that the Republican leaders of both the House and the Senate, right, will go to the president, and they essentially say to him that he needed to go. And Nixon was really in a bad state. In 1973, so a year earlier, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew of Maryland, had to resign. And when it came to light that he had accepted bribes, Nixon, because of the 25th Amendment, had to nominate a new vice president. And he turned to the minority leader in the House, Gerald Ford. And so Ford then became the vice president of the United States. So in 1974, the Republican leadership came to the president, led by Bob Dole of Kansas, and informed Nixon really two things. First, the Judiciary Committee had adopted 4 articles of impeachment, and that those were now going to be debated and voted on by the House of Representatives. And their count is basically assured that Nixon, in fact, would be impeached by the House of Representatives. If that were then brought before the Senate for trial, this would require a 2/3 vote of senators in order to, in fact, expel Nixon from the White House. Now, at this period of time in the 1970s, only one president had ever been impeached, and that was Andrew Johnson in 1868. But he was not expelled. He went to trial in the Senate, and he survived the trial by literally 1 vote. Well, in 1974, the Democrats had the majority of the Senate, but they didn't have a 2/3 majority. So they were going to require some Republicans to vote guilty in the Senate. Bob Dole informed Nixon in these private conversations in 1974 that he, as the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, would tell them to vote their conscience and not their party. And Nixon realized that he was definitely up against the wall. And he decides to become the first president to resign in office, which he does in August of 1974. And in one of the most unusual periods of American history, we get the election of Gerald Ford. And now, the effects of Watergate are rather severe. Since the U.S. Nixon decision, there have been numerous backs and forth about what does executive privilege include, what does it not include, when is it okay to pursue the private papers and consultation advice of a president, and when is it not. If you're following the Trump saga, this is what's going on right now in terms of the Democrats demanding access to his tax returns and to have advisors come forward to testify in reference to possible obstruction issues. So these are all things that come from this period. Nixon was accused of delaying information, a tactic that's now referred to as stonewalling. Nixon would get a subpoena for certain documents. Let's just say it was like a 3-month subpoena. He would wait the entire 3 months, and then he would submit the documents, but there would be pieces missing, and so they would have to issue another subpoena for the missing pages, and on and on and on it goes. This is something that we're going to see in other presidencies. Reagan's going to do it in reference to the Iran-Contra scandal that we'll talk about, and then we're going to see it with the Clinton administration and the Obama administration. Now, another effect, of course, is the word gate, right? Every scandal that a president gets involved in is going to have the word gate at the end of it. So there's going to be Iran's Contra Gate, there's going to be Monica Gate, there's going to be File Gate. There's just, all of them have these, this added to it. So it's a major explosive event in the United States. And after the publication of the Pentagon Papers that revealed just how much the government was lying to the American people under Johnson about Vietnam, the combination just made Americans very, very despondent and disillusioned with their government. So when we get our only unelected president of American history, Ford vetoed 39 bills while in office. It's only 2 years, more than Hoover, who had a full term to do so, right? Ford rejected pressure to cut taxes and spending, resulting in a plummeting economy and unemployment as high as 9%. Now, being an unelected president, so Ford becomes president without ever being elected to executive office. He then had to nominate a vice president, and he chose the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller. And so the problem with that is, while it follows the Constitution clearly, there's no electoral mandate for the president. He could not really act on his own because he didn't have an electoral mandate to do so. And this hamstrings him pretty badly. Now, from Ford's own mouth, we get his conversations and thought processes on what was going on at the time he takes office. The country was in incredible turmoil. Obviously, inflation was still a very big problem. The stagflation situation was significant. As I just said, unemployment is going to go up to 9%. Inflation was also going up. So things were not getting better on the domestic front. There were still protests in the streets about what's going on. There are going to be two assassination attempts against Gerald Ford in the 2 years that he's president. Both of them are female assassins. And the situation in Vietnam was imploding aggressively. And so Ford had an incredibly full plate and a lot of external and internal pressures that were playing on him. At the same time, every single day, according to Ford and advisors around him, every single day, the big issue, the dominant issue every day was what's going to happen to Richard Nixon. Once he left office, he no longer had immunity from prosecution, which meant that any illegal acts that he had done while he was president of the United States were now open game for prosecution. And a lot of people are going to condemn Ford for pardoning Nixon. Ford's rationale was he couldn't deal with anything else. This issue about Nixon dominated forever, and his feelings were that allowing this to dominate the conversation was going to dog him too much, when in reality he felt that a trial of a president was going to create the kind of civil unrest and political upheaval that he didn't know that the country could survive. So he gave Nixon a full pardon. In my opinion, this is why Gerald Ford only serves 2 years and never gets a chance to be elected. So the stagflation numbers are going to get really high. And really, in 1975, Ford is going to engage in something that in the long run proved to be very successful, but at the time he got a lot of abuse. Ever since World War II, there had been a series of conversations happening in places like Geneva and in Vienna about the expansion of human rights in international affairs. And this culminated in 3 different, what were called baskets of agreements dealing with human rights issues. And so there were debates happening about the culmination of this, which was going to take place in Helsinki, Finland. Ford decided to take an active role in those accords. His advisor, Henry Kissinger, felt that this was a distraction, that the only thing that mattered was the American relationship with the Soviet Union, the so-called MAD formula, and that as long as détente was being managed, nothing else was important. And he saw this as a distraction, and he believed that Ford would take a lot of political heat for it, and he was right in that respect. A lot of American immigrants from Poland and Hungary and Romania are going to come out vehemently against this. Ford basically signs on to the Helsinki Accords, which in part recognized the existing borders of Europe. And what that meant was that East Germany was in fact East Germany, and Poland and Romania and Hungary and Yugoslavia, all these other places had definitive and real boundaries. And what that implied was that the United States was, in a sense, acquiescing to Soviet hegemony over Eastern Europe. Now, this was the first basket. And so many people felt that Ford had sold out the East Europeans in order to appease Brezhnev. Now, Ford also signs on to the second basket, which was about the free flow of people and ideals across borders. And here we get it a little more tricky. People said that he was being naive, that this was silly. The Soviet Union was never going to do this. And then the third basket had to do with the recognition that human rights were, in fact, a valid issue of international diplomacy. And again, people saw him as naive and stupid and all the rest of it. And what happens is Ford is able to convince Brezhnev to sign the Helsinki Accords. And with Brezhnev present, Ford gives an address in Helsinki talking about how signing this document or these documents was in fact committing all the powers to respect human rights. Now, in the 1990s, Gerald Ford, as the ex-president, is going to receive the Profile and Courageous Award from the Kennedy Library in Harvard. And he gets them for 2 reasons. One is for having the courage to pardon Nixon, even though it probably ended his political career. And the other was signing the Helsinki Accords. What happens after this accord gets done is that human rights activists inside East Europe and the Soviet Union start to advocate for more rights. And this internal resistance movement is going to help contribute to the downfall of the Soviet Union. And so this is something that very few people give Ford credit for, and very few people know about it, but it in fact did happen in 1975. So in the election of 1976, Ford had to actually battle the California governor, Ronald Reagan, for the Republican nomination. And he did eventually get it, but it was a very, very close call. And Reagan and his supporters did not, let me say, go away quietly. In some states, like New York, where I grew up, there were independent parties called the Conservative Party, and others had a new third party called the Libertarians. And some of these groups nominated Reagan, even though he didn't get the Republican nomination. Usually, traditionally, the Conservative Party would nominate whoever the Republicans nominated. And this started in 1964 with Barry Goldwater. Well, Reagan was asked to go out publicly and ask the conservative parties of New York and a couple of other states to please take his name off the ballot and replace it with Ford, but he refused to do that. And there are a lot of people in the Ford camp who believe that that was probably one of the main reasons why Ford doesn't win the election. But out of Georgia comes Jimmy Carter, the Democratic nominee, who was a millionaire peanut farmer, but also a former nuclear physicist for the Navy, an Annapolis graduate that helped design the American nuclear submarine, rose to power as an outside the Beltway reformer. And Carter promised the American people that he was going to be a man of the people, that his administration would be scandal-free, and that the era of Vietnam and Watergate and scandal and expansionism, interference by the United States was over. And what is the idea of reformed government is going to launch the Carter's presidential aspirations. And it's an incredibly close election. The Electoral College split 297 to 240 with only 2 million votes separating the two candidates. This is an incredibly close election, and that's why some people believe that defective Reagan votes to the Conservative Party probably did make a lot of the difference. And so the Ford years come to an end, as does some people refer to it as the Imperium presidency of Nixon, and we go into the reformed era of James Earl Carter III.